Chapter 6, November 2nd, 1967. Where do you want to start? We start in the engine room and we work our way up. And what are we looking for exactly? Who, not what. Okay, who are we looking for exactly? You're what, 25? 26? I'm 29 years old. Let me guess. You're about 6'3", 6'2". And what? About 220? Good guess. What does that have to do with anything? Your shoe size. My shoe size? What about it? By the looks of it, your boots are size 13. Harry fucking Houdini. Not quite. What would you guess the average male shoe size is? Over or under 10? Over for sure. 10 and a half. Great. So what's your point? You've been first mate for how long now? 5 years. In those 5 years, have you seen a lot of sailors with a size 8 shoe? The first mate started laughing at the absurd non sequitur. Can't say. Haven't given it much thought? Not in the least. Precisely my point. The small details often make the biggest difference, but most people drift through life without even noticing. First Mate Hodges pulled out his loop of keys. The keys jingled and jangled as he flipped through them to find the elevator key. He moved through the loop like a secretary scanning Rolodex. One of the keys was tagged as elevator. Hodges pulled it out like a ripe cherry tomato fresh off the vine. In that room, there were maybe a dozen or so footprints, one of which was a size 8 boot. You know a lot of sailors walking around here wearing a size 8 boot? I don't know about you, but seems rather peculiar to me. I see your point. I don't rely on luck. I rely on statistics. I rely on odds. I play the odds and take a bet. First Mate Hodges stuck his hand out and asked, "What floor?" Let's start from the bottom and work our way to the top. The way I figure it, we have just under 9 hours to light a fire under the unsub. Unsub? Unidentified suspect. Ah. You ever play hide and seek? The kids' game? Yeah, that's the one. It's been about 20 years. The thing about hide and seek is that everyone tends to have a reliable favorite spot to hide. Think of this like an elaborate game of hide and seek. Put yourself in the killer's shoes. You commit a quadruple murder. Where do you go? First Mate Hodges scratched his chrome dome for a minute. Clearly he was lost in deep contemplation. Where would I go? The obvious spot would be the engine room. Tell me why. It's loud, humid, dimly lit, and everyone minds their business. The engineers are too busy working on keeping the ship moving to notice anything out of the ordinary. It's a mess down there. Where's the next best spot? Next best. I'd say the cargo hold in the forward bow. Plenty of ways in and plenty of ways out. It's a veritable maze of scattered suitcases. A lot of crew in the cargo hold? Not really. It operates on a skeleton crew, more or less. So, we're stuck between an engine room and a cargo hold. If I were a betting man, I'd put my money on the engine room. The engine room it is. Lead the way, sailor. First Mate Hodges obliged the detective with an affirmative nod and began to fiddle with the controls of the elevator. The elevator was controlled by a single gold-plated lever with various markings etched onto the device. Hodges yanked down on the lever like an arm wrestler slamming an opponent's hand down. The two men stumbled back a bit as the elevator plummeted towards the engine room. Mike braced himself and grabbed onto one of the conveniently placed handrails. In typical sailor bravado, Hodges locked out his knees and stood at attention. Bravado was a young man's game, and Mike was in the twilight of his career. As the men made their descent into the inner bowels of the ship, each floor was distinctively marked by the clang of a bell. Clang, clang, clang. First Mate Hodges attempted to break the silence by spouting out some superstitious mumbo-jumbo. This vessel, she claimed so many lives over the years. Too many. Mike looked back at the first mate with a certain level of skepticism. The elevator light reflected off of his head like a newly shined bowling ball. It's haunted. Don't tell me you believe in ghost stories. Stories? I've seen it with my own eyes. Clang, clang, clang. Seen it? And what is it exactly? This boat has a ledger, you see. A ledger written in blood. A ledger. The detective was understandably skeptical of the first mate's allegation. Bromides aside, the detective decided to prolong the conversation. At this point, shoe size or not, Mike couldn't rule out any of the crewmen. The Queen. She's claimed so many lives over the years. Son, workplace accidents happen all the time. Would you qualify what happened up there in the suite as a workplace accident? Clang, clang, clang. Would I? Depends on the circumstances of the accidents. Whirr. A loud screeching sound rang out as the first mate slammed down on the operator's handle. Circumstances? Well, did you witness any of these accidents? Did I? No, not personally. But some did happen under your watch. Under my watch? I didn't become first mate because I have schlock for brains. To a fancy detective, that might not mean anything, but on this boat, that means something. Don't forget it. Mike noticed the back of the first mate's hand began to turn pale as a ghost. He clamped onto that lever harder than a hippo chomping away at a watermelon. As the first mate reversed the lever back to the engine room, he pulled back his sleeve just enough for Mike to notice a fresh cut on the outer crest of his right wrist. Occupational hazard? Mike said while pointing to the freshly concealed wound. I know what you're getting at, and I don't care for it. Clang, clang, clang. Mike learned an invaluable lesson from sparring the great Willie Pep in a boxing match. He who hits and runs away lives to fight another day. For now, his verbal lashing was stymied for the time being. The way Mike figured it, the first mate was clean. At least he was clean enough. See, you learn a thing or two on the beat. For instance, Mike learned that the quickest way to light a fuse was insinuating someone for something and wait for the fireworks. In this case, the first mate passed that test with flying colors. He kept a cool head, but stood his ground to defend his honor. He didn't fly off the handle, nor did he cower in a bevy of lies. Luckily for Mike, the elevator slowed to a snail's pace and calmly sunk to the bottom of the vessel. We've arrived. So it would seem. I hope you're as good as you think you are. I guess we're both about to find out. First Mate Hodges snatched the handle of the accordion-style elevator door like a fishmonger clasping onto the fresh catch of the day. The door wasn't amenable to delicate touches. It took brute force to free it from the locked position. Luckily, Hodges had plenty of it to spare. He jerked on the door and forced it open. After you, he said with his arm extended out with an inviting motion. You're too kind, kid, Mike said as he departed the elevator. He gingerly stepped further into the engine room, making sure to not get too far ahead of himself. The first mate was meant to be an escort, not a shadow. The engine room had the ambiance of a graveyard at the stroke of midnight. Lanterns and cisterns filtered incandescent light like a flashlight filtered through a kaleidoscope. Mike took another tepid step onto a staircase. The steel had become moist from years of uncleaned soot and humidity. You've seen the first-class cabins. Welcome to the working class, the first mate said while pulling a flashlight from his back pocket. He flipped the on switch only to be met with a half-working flashlight. It flickered on and off, like an old radio attempting to keep a frequency. Mike extended his helping hand out to the first mate and snatched the flashlight from his grasp. Mike looked it over one time and slapped the head of the flashlight with his palm, like a parent gently calming a gassy newborn. Just like that, the flashlight sprung back into life and faithfully fulfilled its duty. Mike smirked and handed it back to the first mate. Where, oh where has my little lamb gone? Oh where can it be? Mike asked quietly while scouting out the engine room for possible clues. He planted his hands firmly onto his hips like a stoic college football coach. First Mate Hodges hoisted his flashlight from floor to ceiling, looking to light up the room. Where to? We need to scour every crevice of this room. That might take some time, Detective. It'll take a lot less time if we quit squawking and start searching. Without a word spoken, the men bolted into action and sped off into the engine room, like a Formula One car spinning out of a pit stop. The men searched high, the men searched low. The men searched for what they did not know. First Mate Hodges took a moment to collect himself. Apparently, the aimless searching had paid a heavy toll on the young first mate. In all reality, it was probably the triple-digit temperature that weighed heavily on the young man. How do you do it? What? Be a detective? Yeah, how do you do it? How do you deal with all the death? Dealing with death isn't easy, but it's a lot easier if you can bring justice for the victim. If? If. First Mate Hodges glanced over to the corner of the room and spun his flashlight over to get a better look. Mike? Mike looked back at the first mate with an exhausted expression. The first mate spotted something rather unusual sitting in the corner of the room. There was a brownish-red duffel bag stuffed into the corner of the engine room. Mike placed his hand on the chest of the first mate, like the instinctive reaction of a mother staring down a head-on collision and placing her hand over her child's chest before the crash. Mike wandered over the duffel bag, making sure to keep a tedious recollection of his steps. The last thing he wanted to do was trample a potential crime scene. Keep the light on me. Stay here, he said to the first mate. Hodges stood fast and steady. The flashlight was shaking up and down as Mike approached the bag. Mike looked back at the first mate in an attempt to calm his obviously shook nerves. Mike pulled out a ballpoint pen from his front breast pocket and started poking around the bag. He gently poked and prodded the duffel bag without saying a word. Mike was unable to discern any odor from the bag, which was probably due to the heavy aroma of musk wafting in the engine room. Mike pulled back the outer rim of the duffel bag with delicate precision, like a groom nervously pulling down a garter belt. Mike pulled the pen out of the bag and placed it back into his pocket. What is it? It's a sign. A sign? Don't quit your day job, Mike said as he pulled the bag around to show the first mate. To the first mate's surprise, it was a bag full of undergarments. Okay, Mr. Detective, tell me something. Something? Something about what? About these undergarments? About me. Ah, happenstance. I love it. Okay, what would you like to know about yourself? Mike asked while framing a portrait around the first mate with his hands. Crime, like life, is about odds. Not chance, but odds. You're young and ambitious. That's not telling me much. Mike smirked at the lugubrious nature of the first mate. It was an all too familiar feeling that he could empathize with. I'd say you're a middle child. Good guess. Life is an odds game. I played the odds. About 25% of children are middle children. I took a shot based on all the available data. Available data? Mike smiled and said, You keep your shoulders back. You are froth at the mouth with ambition. You have a moderate to high respect for detail. The seams on your uniform have the telltale sign of anal retentiveness. You care about what people think about your appearance. Like I said, all the telltale signs of a middle child. Those are telltale signs? Believe it or not, 52% of all United States presidents were middle children. To be such a young, presumably competent leader, it was a safe assumption that you are a middle child. I'll be damned. Now, speaking of odds, we're burning the candle at both ends and we seem to be up the creek without a paddle. What do you suggest? I suggest we finish our dawdling and move on, Mike said with a hint of doom and drudgery. The air was thickened by the humidity of the steam boilers, engines, and furnaces. Mike's pace slowed to a snail's crawl, like a pack-a-day smoker trying to run a marathon. First Mate Hodges noticed Mike's impingement and slowed his pace in kind. Mike took a moment to catch his breath and drum up some small talk. Could you imagine working down here? Don't have to imagine. I started my career over near that very cistern. The cistern was covered in grime, soot, and rust. There was a rusted, covered, circular shutoff valve attached to a recently replaced pressure gauge. The cistern stood in the center of the room and obstructed most of the throughways in the engine room. Mike had little appreciation for the lack of unintended consequences in the obvious design flaw, but had little motivation to bring it up with the first mate. How do you deal with it all? There was a time when I was young, dumb, and full of cum. When I was a rookie, I was more of an idealist. I wanted to change the world, one caper at a time. What happened? I realized the truth. The truth? Mike took a deep breath and slowly exhaled as if to lift the weight of the world off his shoulders in one swell breath. Human nature. Yeah? What about it? My first ride along was a drug raid on the Long Beach Pier that ended up in a gunfight. We received a tip from an informant that a street gang had procured 100 kilos of heroin. Turns out it was nothing but a bunch of kids. We showed up. They scattered to the wind. Somehow I ended up on the receiving end of a revolver. I took 3 in the leg and 1 in the head. It was a miracle I survived. Groovy. Not quite. The point is, you can go around trying to change the world, but odds are it'll end up changing you. The two men leaned up against the cistern to contemplate their next move. Time was working against them, almost as much as the humidity. Mike looked at his grizzled guide and opined, "It would appear our investigation of the engine room here has run its course." What's next? You gonna start talking in the third person? That sarcastic retort was just what Mike needed to get his head back in the game. A little added fuel for the fire, like spraying some lighter fuel on a dimming campfire. Cargo hold, Mike said with a renewed sense of vigor for the chase. Cargo hold Avante, Hodges replied in kind. Mike smiled at his compatriot and headed back towards the elevator. You speak Italian? You learn a couple things traveling across the world. Tu parle l'italiano? Si. I'm a little rusty. Alan doesn't sound very Italian. Not enough vowels, Hodge said while trailing off. Believe it or not, when my mother came over from Sicily, the government changed her last name at Ellis Island. Maria Allendrato became Mary Allen. Hodges shook his head at the idea of arbitrarily changing someone else's name. A name is precious. It represents a lineage, a heritage, a bond. It was a different time back in the early 20th century. A different time. Seems so long ago. A lot's changed. A lot stayed the same. Fair, Mike said as he opened the accordion door to the elevator. The outer perimeter of the door had begun to sweat like a whore in church. Mike and Hodges hopped into the elevator like brothers fighting over who gets to stand in front of the open refrigerator in a house with no air conditioning. The elevator raced up to the cargo hold. In no short order, the men had arrived at the ship's forward cargo hold. Hodges opened the door, but held his hand back, belaying Mike from stepping off first. He looked both ways and stepped off with some trepidation for his new destination. Something's not right. Hodges struck his flashlight with the palm of his hand. The metal flashlight clapped against his hand like the clacking of a brass shell casing smacking the ground after being freshly ejected from a shotgun. The light from his flashlight wasn't dependable, but it was effective. It hobbled back to life and glimmered around the room. Mike peered his head out of the elevator and squinted his eyes. There was an aroma unlike any that he had smelt before. He cautiously followed his would-be guide into the cargo hold. What is it? It's empty, sir. That was kind of the point, wasn't it? It's too empty. Interesting. Drip, drip, drip. Mike looked at his shoulder and patted off some falling droplets of condensation from the ceiling. As he patted down his peacoat, he noticed a discoloration on his palm. On first inspection, he assumed it was grime. He inspected it closely, like a scientist sighting in the magnification of a microscope. First mate. First mate Hodges turned on a dime, like a shortstop pivoting to throw a runner out at second base. He honed his flashlight on Mike Allen, like a prison guard flashing a floodlight spotting an escaped convict. Mike held out his hand to inspect the droplets in the dimly lit cargo hold. What do you got? Mike slowly looked up towards the ceiling with the same hesitation he felt on his first ride along. A jolt of energy tingled up his limbs. His hands turned clammy and his skin pale as a ghost. Mike took a big gulp and pointed towards the ceiling. First Mate Hodges followed the finger like a hound following the scent of an escaped convict. He shined the flashlight onto the ceiling to find a pool of red liquid on the ceiling. Jesus H. How do we get to the next floor? Follow me. The two men ran towards one of the poorly lit corridors that led to a stairwell. Luckily for the duo, the cargo hold was less obtusely designed than the engine room. The design flaws were about as emblematic as the endless tales of demise. This ladder, it goes to the next floor, he said while grabbing onto a maintenance ladder. Mike brushed his hand from the ladder, only to receive a perplexed look on the face of the young first mate. Mike posted his shoe onto the ladder and pulled out his nickel-plated revolver from his ankle holster. I don't know about you, but I don't plan on going up there just holding my dick in my hand. Hodges nodded and stood fast at the base of the ladder. I'm going up. Stay down here and wait for me to clear the room. Hodges took a deep breath and focused his light on the porthole at the top of the ladder. Mike tucked the revolver into the back of his waistband and started climbing up the ladder. The outer rungs of the ladder were crusted with a rosy bronze. Years of neglect had worn away the coating on the ladder rungs. Mike grabbed each rung with a sturdy tenacity, like the subtle caressing of a hangman's noose. The back of his hands turned pale white as he clamped onto each rung. Sweat rolled down both sides of his hands, making each preceding climb unnecessarily difficult on the detective. Mike swung open the hatch at the top of the ladder. He placed one hand on the top rung and one on his revolver. Mike jumped into the fray with his pistol drawn, like Butch Cassidy rushing out of the cantina with guns blazing. He swung around to his left. Nothing. He swung around to his right. Nothing. He looked up. Nothing. He scoured every corner of the room like a dog sniffing out crumbs on the dining room floor. He decocked his revolver and placed it back into his waistband. The silence was a deafening omen that echoed through the bowels of the ship. Mike popped his head out and hovered it over the open hatch, like a whack-a-mole popping out of a hole. His face was clammy and moist, like a freshly doused paint roller dripping droplets of water-based flat Swiss coffee. Mike stared down the hatch at the eagerly awaiting first mate. He wiped the sweat from his brow and began to exfiltrate the hatch back on down the ladder. His descent was as bumpy as a 747 landing in a snowstorm in the middle of winter. I need you to hail the captain, son. The first mate started rubbing the tips of his fingers on the switch of a flashlight. He stood there staring at the detective with nothing more than a big stupid grin on his face. After romping through the inner bowels of the vessel all night, the first mate felt entitled to a more detailed explanation. He flickered the switch on and off with a nervous litany, like the inceptive gaze of an alcoholic staring down the end of a bar top. What happened? We've located the missing passengers.